Hi everyone, my name is Maya Poet. Welcome back to my channel. Today I have a really interesting guest with me whose name is Soren, and I will let her introduce herself in a second. First, I'll just talk a little bit about how we met. We met at a conference, a GenSpec conference in Denver, Colorado last year, and we struck up an awesome friendship. We made a lot of different arts and crafts in hotel rooms.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun. And I saw her doing some homework at a desk at this conference, and we'd started talking a little bit, and it turns out that she had studied Arabic. And so she's a fellow detransitioner, a really insightful, intelligent person who is also quite young, younger than me, and has a lot of really interesting insights, not only into her own story and the factors that drew her into transition and out of transition, but additionally about the types of social changes that need to be made in order to create a society which is not so hostile towards the types of people, the types of vulnerable children and adults who are getting sucked into transgender identification. So with that, Soren, welcome to my channel. And yeah.
Well, thank you, Maya. It's a pleasure to sit down and actually talk to you, I guess, on this subject. I am Soren. I am a detransitioner out of Texas. I am also an undergraduate researcher at the University of Texas at Austin. And I wear many hats. Like you were noticing at the conference, I'm a student. I have always been a sort of leader in my community, or I've tried to be for about as long as I can remember, like starting as early, as whenever I was in Girl Scouts and like second, third, fourth grade to playing softball throughout my adolescence. And even when I was trans-identified, leading protests and such. But now I think a lot of that has manifest in my detransition awareness. I have a lawsuit here in the state of Texas up in Tarrant County, which is in the Fort Worth area, right next to Dallas. And that lawsuit still ongoing, but something that I think is going to be very important to where this movement, the movement against gender ideology, will be in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Like, the law is where everything starts. But we met at the Denver GenSpec conference. When I saw you at the Denver GenSpec conference, I remember you walking in, and you have a moment when you see someone who's like butch and female but has short hair, and this sounds so stereotypical, but you see someone that looks like that and you kind of go, okay, are they here for the conference with me, or are they someone I probably should be mindful and talking to, right? And then lo and behold, you were there, you had desisted, and you had this amazing, like, brave story that I think really resonated with me because of my own experiences, but also just like the fact that you came out of it in a very different way than me, in some regards, right? Because you didn't medicalize, and I'd love to talk about like and compare and contrast those experiences. But I think that was definitely what made us like become so drawn to each other, was the shared experience. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a great topic to discuss because within each of our stories are a lot of lessons for young people and for their parents that I think could really illuminate sort of the psychological process that a young person, a child, or a teenager is going through when they start to identify as trans, and the factors that lead them out of that, well, both in and out of that, as some helpful insight. So I guess I'll just ask you for a little bit of a rundown of your story. Like, how old were you when you got into the sort of idea of transgender? Like, how old were you? And tell me a little bit about like what was going on in your life around that time.
yeah, so that's a great question. I first was exposed to the idea of transgender around age 11. I was in all of these online art spaces. Like, I was really into digital art, me and every other 11-year-old girl, right? But I would draw a lot on my DS specifically, and that, I think, was a piece of technology that my parents were familiar with, but it's not like it's a PC. You know what I mean? The DS was like our generation's like first handheld device, and being able to access the internet on that, I got into all sorts of trouble. Like there was these online communities and fandoms, and fandoms can be great when it comes to development because we develop our sense of self through taking on the sense of others, like through the role of others, through role models, and in doing that, I got into some fandoms that were good, and I got into some fandoms that were full of adults who like to do make-out rings at conventions. And
wait, can you pause for a second? So what exactly is a fandom for those of us who don't know?
So for those of you who don't know, a fandom is like a fan base. People kind of conceptualize it like a fandom is like a fan kingdom, like this sort of like group of individuals with whom you enjoy a piece of literature, a movie, a television show with. And I was in this fandom that some of y'all might cringe when you hear me say it, but I was in this fandom called the Homestuck fandom. It was this web comic, and the comic itself is amazing. Like it's full of all these characters. There's a lot of like symbolism, and it's one of those fantastical works where it's easy to immerse yourself because like the main character is like 13. A 13-year-old boy is kind of awkward. And like what like 11, 12-year-old kid like doesn't like see that kind of character and go, oh my gosh, that's me. Like I also hate my parents, but the fan base is a real grab bag. Like the fan base is feral is the easiest way to put it. Like they, like I said, are the type of people where they're at a convention, they all just like gravitate towards one another. And like I mentioned like the makeout ring, like they were doing like spin the bottle with everyone from like 13 years old. I was like 11 or 12 at the time to like probably in their 20s. It's messed up, but like these things, like when you're a kid, it's like so cool because you're like, oh my god, I'm with all these teenagers. And online, obviously, I'm not able to play spin the bottle with strangers, but you get into cosplay and you get into going on Omegle and you start talking to men, and I'm sure a lot of you can fill in the dots there, or connect the dots there. But you have that, you have at that age, I'm starting to go through puberty. I'm playing softball, but thanks to my mom and my dad's side of the family was rather had rather large breasts, and so coming to terms with this rapidly changing body of mine while I'm interacting with these fandoms who are sexualizing women, and it's a very material focus, I think, on the human experience, despite the intellectualism of engaging in a piece within a fandom, right? That when you combine those things with something that was actually pretty tragic in that point in my life, I lost my grandmother, who was like a mother to me. You kind of get this child who is searching for who she is, and that's actually not uncommon at that age at all. But finding transgender ideology through a friend of mine that I'd met through these online art spaces who I had a huge crush on because she's this older girl, like beautiful, amazing artist. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're a little kid and you're drawing art and you're just so critical about it, but then you see this older kid who just can just whip it out. You know what I mean? Like just do it without even thinking twice about it. Like I was very attracted to that and very I admired that. And when we started quote unquote dating, which was just we'd spend hours on the phone together, she started identifying as trans, and I remember seeing her life story, like raised Catholic, wanted short hair, her family was like, you can't cut your hair, like all the things that I heard echoed in my own life and reflected in my own life. I thought maybe I'm a boy too, because she'd draw these art pieces that would have like a picture of it would be like a self-portrait, and she'd draw her head as blue and her body as pink, to reflect the whole I have a boy's brain and a girl's body. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like me being this sporty, athletic, awkward, creative, like outgoing, funny girl, like I was like, oh my gosh, that's like SpongeBob stuff. Like, like that's obviously boy stuff. And, the rest is history. Like once I got into it in that way, it was very much like a role play identity. Like it wasn't something that I was planning on, like actively pursuing in the way that you might like the way I was pursuing softball, for example, but it was still very real in those online spaces because I do, and I'll talk about this later, believe that online spaces are very much an influence when it comes to like dissociative identities, like especially if that's the only area in which you're getting enrichment for your identity.
Wow.
And that was a lot. I'm sorry,
no,
but it's a lot. There was a lot going on in my life at the time.
No, don't apologize. That I think that's exactly the type of insight that parents need to hear because these days, and really starting from about 10 or 12 years ago, there was this shift happening in the types of influences that shaped the social lives and social development of young children, because smartphone technology advanced and became cheaper for people to access. Yeah. And so they were able to afford, adults were able to afford smartphones and tablets, not only for themselves, but also for their children.
Oh, yeah.
And so this fundamentally changed the landscape of the type of world that kids who were, coming into their sort of pre-adolescent and adolescent years online, starting sort of 12 years ago, and even today, like your kids are being socialized on the internet. The internet is the place, if you can call it a place, that most children are engaging in most of their social interactions when they are not physically within a school building or an extracurricular activity. And so it's really important for parents to know the types of online influences that their children are really encountering in their most vulnerable developmental periods.
Yeah. And if I may add, not even just being aware of them, but being aware of what it's like to be that child on the internet. Because I know my parents, like, they knew, like, and I think many parents knew that there are bad things out there on the internet, right? Like, my parents were very much trying to be vigilant about, like, okay, how can we protect you from predation online, right? But us kids, like, we have a totally different perspective on it because we don't have that wisdom that our parents do, and we think that everything our parents are doing is to control us and not to, like, protect us. And I do think it's easy for parents to act out of a fear of ignorance, like a fear of ignorance is what I'm saying, where they're scared to not know, and therefore often unable to explain why they're doing what they're doing. But to be that kid, like, I think that if my parents had really sat down and taken the time to explain to me why they were doing what they're doing, and again, to explain in depth, like, hey, there are people who are going to deceive you online, and who are going to attempt to get you into a vulnerable position and to take advantage of your vulnerability online. And even though you're sitting here listening to me and thinking it's not going to happen to you, like, hun, there will be a time where that happens to you. To, turn it from this hypothetical into this real thing. Like, I think making it tangible for kids is one way to be more effective in that regard. Because I guess to simplify what I'm saying, like, it's good to think about it as a parent, to know about it too, but then to also be able to put yourself into your kid's shoes and to take on that theory of mind is important, and just as important, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important for parents to, look up the types of content that their children are viewing in order to gain a better sense of perspective, because parents were once children themselves, and
Exactly.
while parents these days did not grow up, or, well, most parents that have kids who are old enough to sort of be vulnerable to the type of indoctrination online and the type of predation online that can make their children vulnerable, not just to explaining their distress away with a transgender identity, but just to all kinds of harm that they know can afflict their children on the internet. Really, I think it is prudent for parents to, especially if your kid talks about some fandom that they're a part of, or some type of online community that they're a part of. If you do have that type of relationship with your kid where they share things about their social life, it would definitely behoove you to find yourself on those forums and see the types of discourses that your child is really entrenched in, and the types of discourses that they may have not yet discovered, but that they could discover, in order to sort of predict possibly the types of messages that your kid is getting, and to sort of inoculate your kid against some of those more negative or just blatantly untruthful and harmful ideas that they're being exposed to.
Oh, exactly.
So I'd like to get back into your story. So you were on these online fandoms, and you were going through puberty. You had suffered this loss of this important mother figure in your life. And I guess what I'm wondering is, what was the moment? Do you have a memory of the moment that you discovered the idea of transgender, and how, sort of, what you thought about that, or what the discourses were about that at the time that you discovered that? Do you have something that you could, like, tell us about that?
Yeah, so it was very different, I think, the culture back then than it is now. Like, the culture back then, as I referenced earlier, was very much of, I am a male mind and a female body. I think we were more aware of our sex at the time. Like, we understood that our bodies were, and yet there was still this association of the body from the mind. And then, like, the disability studies sphere, for example, they use the term body mind to try and, like, remove the gap and the dissociation of those things, because really you can't have a mind without a body and a body without a mind, right? But I think at the time, like I had said, it was more of a role play thing. Like, it was more of a what I wish I could be thing, and not so much I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna grab this thing, and I'm gonna make it happen. Like, we didn't have the manifestation culture, right? Like, we didn't have that boss woman, like, I'm gonna go get the bag, you know, kind of attitude about ourselves. And it was different. I mean, in many ways, aside from the transgender ideology, like when it came to body modification and plastic surgery, like, we've always had these trends of bodies throughout history, and yet at the time I don't think it was as normalized to get a BBL or to get your buccal fat removed. Like, I think that the trends of appearance weren't so much oriented around these surgical and medical interventions. Like, I could be very wrong about this. I could be very wrong. This is an area I'd like to educate myself on more. But, like, it's not like we had, like, Ozempic. You know what I mean? Like, the things we are doing today are much more real and tangible. And that's why I mentioned, you know, make these things tangible for your kids. Understand why your kids are liking the things they're liking, not just why they shouldn't be liking the things that they're liking. But yeah, at the time, again, it was very different. It was just a totally different idea of what being transgender meant. And there was discourse, of course. Like, I was in so many discourse groups, but that was more when I got a little bit older that things started to get more complex, and there was a lot more sectarianism, I think is the word, right? There was a lot more sectarianism going on later than back in like 2013, 2014 when I was first getting into this.
Mm-hmm. So you were 11, correct?
Yeah, I was 11.
When you got into this stuff.
That was 2013, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, we have a few years difference between us. I got into trans at the age of 12 in 2012, and
that was when you first started learning Arabic too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Very, very interesting.
What a time in your life.
I know. What a very interesting time in my life. And I didn't, per se, discover all these discourses right away, because I actually sought out the explanation. I sought out, you know, I've talked about in previous interviews, like about sort of the factors that happened or that were going on in my life around the time that I started to identify as trans. I had crushes on girls. I didn't realize they were crushes. I thought crush was an orange soda, and my peer group was obsessed with the soda. I had all of these physical sensations in my body around specific girls. You know, specifically one day in Arabic class that year, when we were passing around a stack of worksheets and my hand brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates, and I started to experience, you know, increase in heart rate, increase in perspiration, dry mouth, just a general sense of being flustered and not being able to form coherent sentences around girls I liked. I didn't know what that was. I went on WebMD. I looked it up. I typed my symptoms into WebMD. WebMD told me that my symptoms could be correlated with, you know, any one of 3 neurodegenerative conditions that would kill me very shortly. Yeah. I was distressed. At some point, I realized that hanging around girls is what made me feel all of these symptoms of what I thought were an illness. And because I'm a pretty avoidant person, and I was especially avoidant as a 12-year-old, because I didn't know how else to cope with or problem solve. So instead of hanging around girls and trying to figure out what was actually going on with me, I decided to only hang around boys in my class. We formed a strategic pranking alliance to prank the teachers because we realized that it made the girls in the class laugh and give us attention. Of course, the girls were giving my male classmates attention. They weren't giving me any attention in that way that I wanted, but I didn't even know exactly what I wanted. I also was developing my sense of style around that time, and I wanted to dress in the way that my male classmates were dressing. I also wanted to dress in the way that Ellen DeGeneres was dressing because I thought she was cool and charismatic.
Yeah,
and
I know what you mean.
And I had been exposed to the idea of a sex change much earlier in my life because I grew up in a progressive West Coast city, and I'd heard about this both on the radio and seen it in real life. And I'd seen males who were obviously male but wearing skirts and dresses, and when I asked, you know, why are they doing this, it was explained to me as, you know, there are some people who are born male but they have a female soul or a female brain. And that's why they're undergoing this process of a sex change. And at that point in my life, I wanted to know if it was possible for a girl to get a sex change and become a boy. So that's how I got into it.
That's fascinating.
I went online and I Googled it, as one does. And I'd already had previous, like, obsessions with different medical topics, namely namely a pituitary tumor called acromegaly,
We talked about this.
Yes, which causes people to become extremely tall and have asymmetric growth, and these people tend to die very young. So that was the first medical topic I was obsessed with around the age of 8 or 9. And so it was not unusual for me to be hanging out, on sort of medical forums, or to be going on Google Scholar and reading different medical journals. So it was not unusual for me to be hanging around medical forums and to be doing medical research. So that was my pathway into a trans identity. And after several months of intense research, I decided to tell my mom that I thought I should have been born a boy and that I wanted to transition. The response from my parents was decidedly non-affirmative.
Yeah.
Because I come from a Soviet Jewish background, and so there's an automatic sense of paranoia surrounding, any kind of orthodoxies within medical institutions, and just a mistrust or a distrust of institutions simply because of the fact that they are institutions. Because, of course, in the Soviet Union, there was a full-out sort of indoctrination attempt going on to, stifle criticism, freedom of thought, and to imbue children in the society with a political orthodoxy. So there's naturally in my family a skepticism around any kind of orthodoxies that are presented without evidence. So that was sort of the way that the coming out process happened for me in that phase of my life. And I guess I'd like to know a few things. First of all, which specific identity label you chose for yourself at that time, maybe why. And also I'd like to know, how did the coming out process go between you and your family at that time?
Yeah. So I used so many different labels because I was in those internet circles. I mean, I think one of the first ones I used was demi boy. I was like, I'm kind of like a boy, but I still knew I wasn't like a boy, I used, I think, probably the non-binary label at first, but over time I became more decidedly just boy. Trans boy, and specifically trans boy. Trans man, at least in the circles I was in, wasn't used as frequently because a lot of us, I think, and I use the word fetishize in this context, not in the same way that you might use it for an adult, but we fetishized boyhood, we fetishized gay boyhood specifically, because of our obsession with these online fandoms. There was definitely a culture of fetishization of homosexuality where you'd ship two boys together, and that was the only framework I really had for relationships. And so in being attracted to both boys and girls growing up, almost all of my partners, quote unquote, growing up were women, but I definitely had this attraction to the boys, the anime boys, right? So I did use the term trans boy. I used the word, regarding my sexuality, I did everything from gray sexual, which was just not really feeling attraction. But then again, I was 11, 12, 13 years old with a history of being groomed on the internet. I don't think it was gonna be much of a thing for me to have had attraction at the time, regardless. But I used gray sexual. I used demisexual, which is I gotta get to know someone before I want to have sex. Just so funny, because that's basically everyone, right?
Or at least most women.
Or at least most women, especially. But eventually I settled on bi. I'd used pan here and there. That's a whole different discourse. We could have a whole conversation on the bi versus pan discourse. But regarding my actual gender identity, it did stay pretty fixed as boy for a while. At least until I got older, it became binary, trans boy. And then eventually, as I started to get more towards the point at which I would later detransition, it was non-binary, trans boy. I still identified outside of the realm of girlhood and into boyhood. However, I knew I wasn't males. You know what I mean? I knew I wasn't cis men, for example. I knew I was different fundamentally. And I think that's something that most people acknowledge to some extent. I knew very few trans boys and trans men who wanted to be lumped in with boys and men, actually.
Wow.
Right?
That's so fascinating.
It's so fascinating.
God,
Most
that's
of
really
us,
different.
most of
That's-
us wanted to be able to be recognized when talking about girlhood. Like when we talked about like like rates of sexual abuse, like we're like, hey, include us too. But so we would use the term AFAB, right? Like there's this obsession with inclusivity of language, and I think a much more simple term for that would be female. But we didn't want to be lumped in with the AMABs per se. And I did have this feeling towards trans women growing up. Like I definitely did not. I definitely did not have the same reverence for trans women as I did other trans men and trans boys. But to answer your other question of how coming out happened, the first time I remember coming out to my family about anything was in 8th grade. I came out to my mom as bi. Like I was like, Mom, I like boys and girls. And she didn't it wasn't a very positive response, but it wasn't a very negative one either. It was, you are in 8th grade, you are 13. This does not matter right now. And I think that was actually a very appropriate response. Like I wish it was a more nuanced response. Like I wish she asked me more questions and approached it with more curiosity. But I guess her intent, and I've had conversations about this with her since, and I love her and we're very close. I think her intent was to not unnecessarily affirm the identity, to acknowledge that I was a teenager who had some mental health issues, who was just trying to figure out who I was, and that I didn't need to make a big deal out of it. Because at the time there was this culture of like coming out is it's this monumental occasion, and you need to make it an occasion. And I think my mom was just very not a fan of that. But my godfather was originally going to be a gay man before they had a falling out. Like my mom was never homophobic in any way, shape, or form, just cautious. But I will say, growing up, when I wanted to do things like you were mentioning, like, dressing in boys' clothes and cutting my hair short, when I originally wanted to cut my hair short, it had nothing to do with being gay or being trans. It was because I wanted to donate my hair to breast cancer.
Wow.
I wanted to literally, and to children with cancer too, I wanted to cut my hair short and do like the little like ribbon, you know what I mean? Like that I always said my first tattoo is going to be like the little pink ribbon, and I don't even know why that was a thing. Like no one in my family had gotten breast cancer that I was aware of, but I just had this like humanitarian desire. Like I was really philanthropic. I've always been philanthropic in that way. But as I got older, eventually the trans thing became more real. I met my dad for the first time when I was 15. And meeting them, I was like, here's this new family that's a little bit more liberal than my mom. I'm going to come out to them, right? But it was baby steps. I told my stepmom and my dad, I was like, hey, I go by a different name. Here's the name I want to go by. And at first, my stepmom was like, I don't really do nicknames. Like, I'm not good with them. Like, like I'll try, but I can't guarantee anything. And I remember thinking, like, what do you mean? Like, it's just a nickname. Like, what do you mean? And then a month later, after meeting my dad, I was in the hospital, and I was institutionalized. And it was for this break. I got into a fight with my stepdad. My stepdad and I had all sorts of issues growing up. He's disabled, and my parents tried my best, but I always had this sort of resent for him because I felt like he took time away from me and my mom, because my mom had to care for him. And we got into this big fight, and so you have this culmination of like, I hate my stepdad, and I just met my biological dad for the first time. And I snapped, and so I was in the hospital. And while in the hospital, I had to speak to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist noted how I looked. Like, he was like, oh, you have a flat chest, like that's not normal for girls your age. Oh, and you have short hair. Oh, and your name's different on your chart than on your door. Like, what's going on? And so he asked me, like, your name's different on your chart than on your door. Tell me about that. And I was like, it's just a nickname. And he was like, I don't really think so. And so he pressured me to continue talking about it. And he was like, like, there are people who, kind of look like you, and they identify as boys instead of girls. Is that like what's going on? Like, you can tell me. And I told him, like, are you gonna tell my mom? Like, I don't want to tell my mom. And he said, I won't tell your mom. And so I opened up to him. And then I would later find out he turned around and he told my mom. He called home. And this is a complex thing, because I do think parents deserve to know what's going on with their kids. I absolutely do. But there's also, on the other side of that, if he had allowed me to give him the information that I thought was pertinent, of which my gender identity was not, I might have grown out of it. Like, I very well might have, because it wasn't such a thing at the forefront of my mind that I wanted to talk to this dude in confidence about it. And yet he pushed for me to. And so that was the way that I came out to my family, formally, quote unquote, or I guess informally in a way, or informally, was by virtue of being outed.
And you were how old? 13?
I was
14?
15.
15.
I was 15 years old. That was January of 2018.
Wow. So, yeah, that does sound definitely like quite a complex issue. Yeah, like when I remember around the phase of my like gender journey that I was in around that coming out time and trying to figure out, how to handle it. I told my parents I told my mom, and I told her that, I didn't want her to tell my dad. She, of course, told my dad. And I felt as if, that was a massive violation of trust. I also felt as if, the specific parental reaction seemed to be incredibly dismissive in my family. There was not a lot of curiosity. There was not a lot of asking, well, why do you feel this? It was more just my parents trying to engage in argumentation with me and say, oh, but you like poetry and cats. You're so, like, that's evidence for that you're just so effortlessly feminine. You did ballet as a 5-year-old. When I put you in ballet, that's just evidence of why you're so, the phrase that was used was effortlessly feminine. I don't see where this is coming from. This is just a phase. You'll grow out of it. And meanwhile, I was crying. I was in tears. I was extremely distressed, and rather than having that distress be recognized, and rather than having the adults who are the most important influences in my life try to understand what distress I was dealing with, or asking questions about, like, where is this coming from? How did you encounter these ideas? Where have you seen this? Or any of that nature. I mean, the response was very much, shutting me down.
Oh, yeah.
And I understand why that was the response. And it's frankly because especially in the year 2012, this was a pretty unknown concept to parents. And obviously there's like a massive amount of panic that happens for a parent when their child makes a declaration like this. And immediately thereafter, my parents basically took the internet app off of my iPad and put somewhat of a spyware app. And they said, like, everything that you search, we will see.
That's what my dad said.
Yeah.
My stepdad.
And meanwhile, I had a brother who was allowed full internet access whenever, wherever. He would sort of,
Was he normal, like, quote unquote?
Yes, he was normal.
That's fine.
And he was allowed to do whatever he wanted to do on the internet. My parents didn't seem to be very concerned about the negative influences that he as a young boy could be exposed to on the internet. And having, siblings that are close to you in age, definitely, it became an aspect of our already ongoing sibling rivalry. He would tease me with the fact that he got to use his internet whenever, wherever, and mine was heavily restricted. There was also a certain weaponization in my household about the relationship that I had with my brother, who really wanted sort of, he wanted to be popular and he wanted to be normal. He was very, very normal. I mean, he didn't even speak Russian.
Wow.
And so he wanted to be this very, he was this very sort of typical boy of his age, of his generation, American boy. I was, very multicultural even at that age. And I was just an odd duck. Like, that's just the way that I came into the world and the way that I continue to be.
That's so beautiful.
And, oh, thank you.
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, some people think it's beautiful and some people see it as threatening. And,
they do. And
coming especially from a Soviet Jewish background, I think that the reason why my parents, were so negative about my nonconformity, they weren't negative about all of my nonconformity. They were supportive of my intellectual interests. They did realize that I wasn't picking up on social cues and would tell me that often, in some ways that were very helpful and in other ways that were really quite sort of overbearing and paternalistic and made me feel quite claustrophobic, when somebody's whispering in my ear in Russian that I need to, stop twirling my hair, or that I need to, ask more questions or maintain more eye contact. That, of course, made me quite self-conscious, specifically in the context in which I was around my parents. but yeah, so there was a lot going on in my home life surrounding that, and there was definitely a weaponization of the relationship that I had with my brother and his desire to have a normal sister. My brother, he knew that he knew that he could use that in our sibling rivalry to get me in trouble, because he knew that it was a sticking point with my parents. And kids who are that close in age, like, I don't fault my brother. Again, we were kids, right? We were kids who were very close in age, who were engaging in classic sibling rivalry, beating each other up all the time, trying to constantly get on each other's nerves, and to get attention from our parents, like classic sibling rivalry. But in the context of this gender stuff, my brother was well aware, because my parents made it well aware to him, in front of him, that my gender nonconformity and some of my quirks that were less tolerable to my parents were that this was, behavior that they didn't like. And my brother realized that if he played the card of like, oh, all of my friends thought that my sister was my brother, he knew that he could say that around my mother, and really that my mom would try to use my brother's discomfort in order to try to shame me into becoming more conforming, rather than to try to improve the sibling relationship.
Wow.
So everything was very strategic in my house in that regard.
And
yeah.
If I may add, it sounds like something I think we were discussing a little bit earlier about how some parents tend to go straight to control and doing damage control specifically, rather than understanding. When I think that understanding bit will often get through to your kid much more easily and more effectively than trying to change their behavior outright. Does that make sense? I mean, it seems to reflect exactly what you're talking about, this like need to just get you to stop doing it, rather like when you're talking about with your brother, like to get you to just be normal for your brother, than to get your brother to understand you and why you're doing the things you're doing and how it's not shameful or something he needs to put an end to. That's just very interesting.
Right, and it comes from the fact that my parents did not see the things that I was doing as like a cool, quirky, natural variation. Like when I was a little kid, yeah, I could behave in basically as quirky and interesting of a way as I wanted to. But then when I hit puberty, the assumption, especially when my parents realized that I was not picking up much on social cues, they basically thought of my quirks as something that needed correction in a very forceful way, in the same way as, because I was born prematurely and I weighed at birth like a little bit over 1 kilogram. I had a lot of developmental problems growing up. I mean, I never crawled, and so when I fell down, I didn't know how to pick myself up, so I had to be in some kind of like occupational therapy or physical therapy to give me those skills, and I wasn't even a year old at that point. I was a toe walker, so I got Botox injections in my legs and wore leg braces as a kid for a short period of time, and I had a lisp which needed to be corrected. I also didn't learn how to tie my shoes until I was 14, and I had to learn how to swallow liquids properly as well at the age of 14. So all of these different quirks that I had, including the gender nonconformity, right? I think my parents saw it as this is an extension of all the other quirks that need to be corrected. Any deviation from the norm was perceived to be a pathology.
This is something that I feel like I've observed in the current autism movement and autism culture as well, is the lack of nuance between there being things that are advantageous to correct and improve within people, and there being things that really don't hurt anything, that are just different or peculiar. Like, I think about it, like, for me, like, I had a really hard time with eye contact growing up, and then as I got older, like, at first I was like, I don't need to make eye contact, like, why don't you need to make eye contact, and then as I got older, I realized, oh, it makes people trust me, like, it's actually a really helpful skill to have, to choose to make eye contact, and so over time, I taught myself to do it, right? But, like, when it comes to me, bringing up fanciful ideas. Like, I'm someone who I play with ideas a lot. I play with sort of morbid ideas in a way that I think make a lot of people uncomfortable, but that are actually really good for thinking very deeply and reflecting very deeply on our lives. Like, I'm very interested, and we talked about this because it's part of your story. Like, I'm very interested in, like, war and these sort of, like, terrifying aspects of life. Like, I became very obsessed with 9/11 for a period, just trying to understand the tragedy of it. And that's not something that I need to, like, stop doing. Like, maybe I need to learn about when it's advantageous for me, but that's for me. That's not for other people, And I think that it's hard because you have one side who, it sounds like what you're explaining, like, thinks that all of that needs to be normal. Like, everything about you needs to be normal because that just makes life easier. But if everyone were the same, if everyone were quote unquote normal, we wouldn't have society. Like, the whole point of us having diversity is to stay alive and to thrive and to fit all these different niches. And so many different traditions throughout history and in the modern day talk about this with reverence. Like, in the Bible, for example, there's this like part where Jesus talks about how, like, we must be like the one in the body of Christ and how we need arms and legs. And we talk about this in sociology too, where we need to see society as this body, and there's organs within society, and we need, our livers. It's called structural functionalism, literally the idea of seeing the body as or like the society as a structure akin to the body. And so, like, if you see it like that, we need hearts and we need eyes and we need hands. We can't live in a world full of just feet. And especially not left feet is that, like, just...
Right, no, and it's really important that you bring that up because especially life on the internet is very disembodied by nature.
And I think as much as the internet highlights diversity, I also think it institutes a form of cultural leveling as well, where everybody is becoming very the same, especially as Western culture. I think it's very... And this is what's funny about natural selection, quote unquote, is that sometimes the things... Have you ever seen the movie Idiocracy?
No.
This is a movie you need to watch. For anyone who's seen it, the opening scene, it shows you two different families. There's a family of two highly intellectual individuals who are like, yeah, we just finished getting our degrees, like, we're going to get married, but we're not going to have kids yet. We're going to get married and have kids whenever the time's appropriate, when we're stable. And then it cuts to this family where it's like two country bumpkins just having sex like rabbits, having babies, popping babies out, chasing each other around the kitchen with a knife, like, just absurd people, right? But very average people. And it shows their family tree continues to grow, and this family tree continues to be the husband and the wife. And so sometimes the things that are advantageous that spread aren't always the things that are considered the best. They're just the most effective, if that makes sense.
Right, like the most effective memes and the most effective, the most effective sort of cultural units
and rhetoric too.
And rhetoric that proliferates is the one which by nature is the most amorphous. It is the most absolutely general type of rhetorics or frameworks which can encapsulate tons of different people, which include extremely, like, large portions of the ideology, which by nature are pretty modular. Like, you can take certain ideological components out, pop them in, rearrange them, obfuscate them, invert them, and therefore that this makes specific, very modular, horoscope-like ideologies spread in the most veridic possible way so that they can occupy the host. And the host in this case being the consumer, so your child, your teenage child, your young adult child who's getting into these ideas. So that's so it's important that you brought that up.
And something that I learned recently. I was meeting with this priest at the University Catholic Center, and he taught me that the word host actually means victim. And I think that's especially poignant in the context of this, because the internet is like a petri dish for this specific sort of issue, and being that consumer, but not only the consumer, and also but also the product. Mm-hmm. Because on the internet you aren't just consuming, you're being sold. Your views are being sold, your attention is being sold, your statistics are being sold. It's very scary, and you are, I think, being victimized in a way, which I think is what makes victim culture on the internet so attractive too. Is you need to be the best product you can be, right? You have to be able to sell yourself on social media, on video, right?
Wow. It's really interesting that you bring up the victimization element, because we see that the way that social capital is being gained these days within these internet forums is really about victimization. It's not about any kind of legitimate accomplishments or interesting ideas, especially within young people, because young people, most of them, don't have enough life experience to latch onto the more intellectual elements of the internet and try to engage in some kind of like really interesting argumentation. They need more structured environments, like the one I got, like debate clubs or mock trial or model UN, some kind of interesting outlet for these types of intellectual kids who get, really captivated by these internet spaces. They need more structure, because otherwise you're just leaving a bunch of kids, in the wild west of the internet, where they can see anything and they can say anything and they can be exposed to anything without any kind of adult sort of moderating or intervening. Like, they're engaging in these discourses with maybe 11, 12, 13, 14 years of life experience. And they have all of these ideas that are way above their heads, that are very philosophical, that are not in any way embodied. Yeah. And it plays perfectly into this ideology, because the internet culture, especially with video games, you see a lot of boys getting into transgender identification on video games. Yep. And partially I think it's because they can customize their avatars. They can customize their quote-unquote, skin suit or flesh suit.
It's like The Sims. You just go into the mirror and you tap on it and you're a new person.
And a lot of these trans surgeries now that you're seeing are not even attempting to imitate the body of the opposite sex as they had been previously. Not that those previous transsexual surgeries were based on any kind of solid science or evidence base.
But I get what you mean. Like, my mastectomy, for example, I've seen a lot of variations. There are people who get scars straight across the chest. There are people who, I think the more original ones I was seeing, get them to emulate the pectoral line to have that more chiseled physique that a lot of men have. But then for mine are very rounded. Like, they look very rounded and a lot more quote-unquote feminine than I think surgeries were looking like and being operated for 10, 15 years ago. When this first began to take root here in the West.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So I guess,
which is great for me now, because my chest does look a little bit more feminine than it might have otherwise, but
yeah, so I think it's really important that you bring this up, because this sort of brings us into the next, I guess, phase of your life with we've discussed your earlier years, and now we're moving into the sort of medical interventions element. Because you've already discussed your mastectomy, so I feel like it might be prudent to discuss this aspect of your life if you're open to it.
Oh yeah, like from medicalization on.
So let's talk about, I guess.
So I
when did you? So what? First of all, like, which medical interventions did you get done at which ages, and I guess what was the familial reaction to it, and what was your physical, like, embodied feeling as you started to transition, starting socially and then medically? Like, let's start with social transition.
Yeah. So, after I was outed in the hospital, my mom, she didn't want to really acknowledge it. It was very similar to the conversation we had in 8th grade, where she was kind of like, this doesn't make sense. At this point, she was like, I thought my daughter was maybe going to be a lesbian at most, but not a boy, and so she kind of asked everyone, like, hey, let's not affirm this. Like, let's not use a different name. Let's not use different pronouns. Like, she just got out of the mental hospital. Like, let's just let her heal. And, I wasn't there to know how the conversation actually went down, but knowing my mom, like, I can imagine how it did, and I can imagine it looked very similar to what I just shared. And, about a year later after the hospital incident, I pulled my mom into the car. We had just gotten home from somewhere, and I wouldn't let her leave the car. And I had told her, like, hey, Mom, I want you to go to this transgender support group I found in Fort Worth. Like, I'm transgender. Like, I know you know this.
I also came out to my mom in the car.
I know so many people come out to the parents in the car because they're trapped. What are they supposed to do?
Wow.
And it's actually awful. Like, it's so awful to have heightened conversations in a vehicle in a tiny little space. Like, our evolution does not like that. It's suffocating. It's claustrophobic. But that's what I did. And she was like, well, I wanted you to be able to actually come out to me yourself, because I wasn't going to go off the word of a psychiatrist that you didn't even trust enough. Because at the hospital, I didn't get discharged regularly, I asked to leave because I did not feel like the quality of care there was good at all. And so she goes to the support group. She hates it. Like, she is like, they are just sort of asking me to change my entire perspective, and I don't like that, and I don't want to go anymore. And so I got my dad and my stepmom to go instead. And so this is where it gets a little tricky because I have my dad and my stepmom who aren't really wanting to go headfirst into all of this because they barely know me, and yet they are far more accepting of it than my mom and my stepdad are, who have known me my entire life. And so everyone's trying to balance things, like, me having a little sister who doesn't really, she deserves to have a normal childhood, right? And not just in regards to me being trans, but without, like, all the drama of the mental health issues and all of that. Like, how do we help her have the most normal life possible while caring for me as best we can? And so we go to the support group, and in the support group, there are 3 different subcategories. There's the trans adults, the trans minors, and the SOFAs, the significant others, friends, family, and allies. And I'm in the minors group, obviously. My dad and my stepmom go to the adult group. And in the minors group, we're talking about everything from self-harm to our messed up relationships to who's getting the next surgery to who is getting a new fursuit. Like, it's just very fantastical is the best way to put it. Like, it's like we're getting envious of each other because so-and-so started estrogen and I want to start estrogen, or so-and-so started testosterone and I want to start testosterone. And around this time, I met my girlfriend, and she and I met at an anime convention in cosplay, found out we were both transgender, went to different branches of the same school, hit it off. And so on one hand, I am in this support group with trans people. On the other hand, I'm becoming intimately acquainted with a transgender person. And in the support group, I'm seeing 15-year-olds get mastectomies. I'm wondering, okay, my family knows that I'm transgender now. What can I get done now? But at the same time, it was still a mile away from me. Like, it was years away from me. I was 16 at the time. I was like, I'm not going to medicalize until at least I'm an adult. But in the support group, there was a nurse practitioner who was prescribing hormones to everyone, who had a transgender child, who had previously been part of the support group, but is now an adult, like, has a career. And eventually that's who we went to see, because my girlfriend was starting testosterone, and just as I'd been envious of the girls getting mastectomies in the support group, I was envious of her for getting this thing that I so desperately wanted. And she was now leverage for me to convince my mom to sign off medical rights for me to be able to go get the testosterone without her even being there. And so the nurse practitioner, we go and see him. We have one appointment, maybe like 30 minutes less than of talking, and he prescribes me the testosterone. I get my first shot that day, self-administered in the kitchen of my family's home. A week after my girlfriend started hers, mind you. Like, we start literally a week apart from one another. And I mean, a couple months later, this is January 2020, the country shuts down, and I'm under no supervision, just getting testosterone scripts. I end up moving with my girlfriend, which is awful because we're 2 young women on testosterone in the middle of, like, a pandemic where we can't go out, we can't do anything. Like, it's so bad.
Oh God.
So, I mean, at this point, I'd been socially transitioned to some degree, but, coming of age, like, I'm now about to start college online. I'm not going to have to actually deal with the physical consequences of transition, of living as someone passing as a man, at least, like, for years, because I'm not going to be at school. I'm not going to be in the community. And yet, when it comes time to get my mastectomy in 2019, the therapist I was seeing, who had a transgender ex-husband, she claims in my letter that I had been living as a man for over a year in multiple contexts in my life. Like, just blatantly lies on this letter, because with COVID, we know what was going on. That wasn't happening. And even if I was, it's not like I'm truly experiencing life as a man, because that's impossible. And, I go through the mastectomy in 2020, in June of 2020. Actually, 3 years ago to the date we're filming this, which is June 11th, at the Crane Clinic in Austin, Texas. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Crane is notorious within the transgender community for alleged, is what I'm gonna say, awful care. Like, anyone know Scott Nugent? That was Crane. That did that to Scott. But I had seen someone who trained under Crane, not Crane himself, Dr. Ashley DeLeon, and she did my surgery. The surgery itself, the actual day of, like, I woke up. My stepmom was going to take care of me. I went, and this was, I had met with her over the phone for my consultation. I had met with her in person the week before, but this was like the second time I'd ever seen her in person before my surgery, and she's just marking at my chest, asking me, like, what do you want? Like, it felt like conversation we should have had prior to the day of the actual surgery, but, she does the marker, I go, I get put under anesthesia. The rest is history. But for the next week, I stay in Austin, I heal, or so we think. And then the day before my post-op appointment, where we go and I get the nipple bolsters taken off, we notice under the edge of my medical binder that there is all sorts of bruising. And we're kind of like, oh, that's not good. All the photos I've seen online, out of the hundreds of them, only a couple had shown bruising. Like, most of the time, people take off their bandages, especially when they have a drain-free surgery, as I did. They take off their bandages, and their chest is beautiful. Like, their nipples look weird, and obviously their scars are healing, but, like, their chest is flat, and the skin looks normal, and that's that. But for me, there was huge bruises, and we call the medical advice line. They tell me, take off the binder, take photos, and then put the binder back on, and we do that. And they go, yeah, bruising can happen. This is Dr. Santucci, Richard Santucci, that I'm talking to on the phone. He goes, bruising can happen, but just pay attention to the bruising. It should be getting lighter over time. So I go on the next day to my post-op appointment. They take off the bolsters. The nurse says, I've never seen bruising like that before. And yet she doesn't go and get, like, a doctor or anything. Everybody's just kind of, like, you can feel the tension in the air. There was another individual there, I think maybe also a nurse, but I don't fully recall. I do know their name, but I don't fully recall what they were, who was also transgender, who I could tell was kind of like, this is not normal. And you can just see it on their face. But again, nothing happens. I go home. And just as Dr. Santucci advised me, I pay attention to the bruising. And the bruising doesn't, in fact, get lighter. It, in fact, gets darker. And I'm starting to notice it developing in my hips. Bruising developing my hips, which is so peculiar to me, because I'm like, shouldn't it be getting lighter up here? Why am I developing new bruises on a totally different area of my body? And lo and behold, this is a phenomenon with abdominal injury called Gray Turner sign. It essentially means that there's bleeding going on in your chest or your abdomen that is now falling and pooling in your hips. And I'm taking photos of all of this because that's what I do. I was very detail-oriented at the time. I've always been sort of detail-oriented in that way. And I'm noticing I'm developing breasts again. Like, not like breasts, but, like, they look like breasts. Bruising is getting deeper, getting new bruises. And I email them to tell them this, and they write me off. Like, they go, bruising should be getting lighter. Let us know if it's not. I'm like, did you even read my email? I said the bruising was getting worse. Like, this what? But, I continue applying. I'm applying arnica, mind you. Like, I'm doing stuff actively to get the bruising to go away, and it's still getting worse. Not even just letting it do its thing. So eventually I develop a fever. I'm not on any pain meds at the time either, but I develop a fever. So I call the emergency line, and I get Dr. Santucci again. And by the way, he's a urologist. He doesn't specialize in breasts at all. But he's the on-call physician both times, so he's the one that has to deal with my case. Or at the very least, let my surgeon know something's wrong and pass me off to her. But this time it takes 2 hours to get a hold of him, and he's super rude and belligerent to me over the phone, like asking me, like, what's wrong here? I don't see what's wrong here when I send him photos. Just very belittling. And again, I'm in a vulnerable state. Like, I am, at this point, starting to become a little bit hysterical. Like, I'm keeping my cool, but I'm definitely like, dude, there is something seriously wrong. I can feel it. And keep in mind, again, I had these issues for weeks, and at this point I'm like, no, I can feel it. Something's wrong. I need to be seen. And he asked me, this is the dumbest question I think I've been asked at any of this, what do you mean you want to be seen? As if I'm asking him to validate me. Like, oh, I want to be seen. Like, I want you to see me. Like, no, I want you to see me in the doctor's office. I want you to look at my chest and make sure I am not, like, sick, And so he tells me, well, whatever, I can get you scheduled tomorrow. And I'm like, no, I need something today. So I hang up, and I end up driving myself from where I live in the mid-cities area between Dallas and Fort Worth to Dallas, Texas, to UT Southwestern. I'm there for 8 hours. I have to spend a bulk of that by myself alone in a hospital room. They do like all sorts of ultrasounds on me. And during this time period, they're trying to get a hold of the top surgery team there, because they do have a top surgery team there, to see if they can handle my case, and they don't want it. Like, they do not want to come anywhere near it because it's another doctor's complications, and they don't want that liability. And so eventually the breast oncology team agrees to see me. The breast oncology team, a team of women who see vulnerable women all the time, agree to take on my case, and they reopen my scars. Like, they cut them back open. They insert a Pembro strain, which is basically just a tube. They sew them into my sides, but not before they express the most blood I've ever seen come out of my body, ever, out of my chest. They stick a Q-tip in there, they knock all the blood clots out, and keep in mind, again, I'm totally awake on this. I'm on no pain meds, just local anesthetic, watching blood drip out of my body, and for the next week, I'm literally, like, I'm made to do that to myself several times a day, like, standing in the shower naked, just letting, like, it's graphic. And, I contact Crane, and I'm like, guys, like, they message me, they're like, hey, we heard you in the ER. I'm like, yeah, I was in the ER, like, and I reach out to them, and I'm like, hey, at the very least, can you guys compensate my ER visit? Like, I shouldn't have had to go to the ER. It should have been a freaking $20, $30 copay. I should have been able to go to your office and have this dealt with, and it not be hundreds of dollars. And they're like, okay, like, you know, like, they don't say sorry, but they are like, oh my gosh, what happened to you? Like, I didn't, like, De Leon basically tells me I had no idea. And I'm like, how do you have no idea? I've been in communications with your office for weeks. But she says, I have no idea. And I tell them, like, I'm talking to the CEO at this point. Like, I'm like, y'all need to do something about this. And they give me a contract. And they say, okay, we'll pay for your hospital bill. Like, it's like $400 after insurance. We'll pay for your hospital bill, but we need you to sign this non-disparagement agreement. And I read it, and, you know, I catch the non-disparagement agreement. And I tell them, like, look, I don't want to sign away my right to talk about this until I know what you've done to prevent it. Like, I was like, I'm open to signing it, but you need to tell me, like, what training have you done to prevent this? Like, how are you going to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else? And they ghost me. They do not respond.
Wow. So how old were you when all of this occurred?
19.
19.
And I just turned 19. I had turned 19 the month, like, less than a month before my surgery.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, and again, I still hadn't even gone to school in person yet at this point. Like, when I started college in person, because of COVID, I'd already had the mastectomy. I was already healed from it. Yeah, that wasn't until spring of 22, and I had this in January of 2021. I didn't start school in person until after I'd already detransitioned. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, it's awful. I mean, again, 3-year anniversary today, like, woo! But it's also just, like, I look back on it, and, like, I was just trying to live my life as normally as possible. Like, I was literally, like, I was seeing a girl at the time, because me and my girlfriend were separated. And this is the same girlfriend I have today. Like, the girlfriend I was seeing when I transitioned, we transitioned and then detransitioned together, which is, like, a whole nother story. But this girl I was seeing in the meantime, I was traveling to see her, and I'd have these big old ice packs, like, on my chest, like, just trying to live my life as normally as possible, while I'm like, you know, my chest is injured and developing, like, you know, like, infection. One second. I don't know what they're doing. I'm sorry. I'm working about 9 minutes. Why is this pencil broken?
Should I pause it?
Yeah, you can go ahead and do that, and then we'll restart. But, yeah, I had a pretty good attitude throughout it all. Like, I kept my chin up despite the sort of terror that my body was experiencing. And then 6 months later, I detransitioned.
Wow. That's incredible. Listening to your story was one of the main reasons that I realized exactly how medically complicated this path is. And even though by the time I'd heard your story, I had already sort of psychologically desisted from the idea that I should have been born a man and that there was something wrong with me for being female, I really realized upon hearing your story and the incredible medical complications and the ways in which the doctors just totally dismissed you. They provided provided you with awful care, there was a massive issue with one doctor or one clinic doing your procedure. And then when you had complications with it, you weren't able to see the same doctors or even a doctor who was competent or who was trained in the area of medicine that you needed to be trained in. And I think this is a massive problem within gender medicine and within gender care, is that, you know, there are very specialized clinics which are the ones sort of prescribing, or, well, the prescriptions of these hormones, for example, can, from my understanding, be done with a general practitioner. I don't know. At least it's like that in Israel.
The one who was prescribing it to me was just not even a general... I mean, he was a general practitioner, but he wasn't even a doctor. He was a nurse practitioner for a family clinic.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge, prolific issue.
Right, like these treatments don't have FDA approval to be used. Some of these treatments at all in anybody, and some of these treatments for the purpose of treating gender dysphoria. And then when you have complications, you can't even go back to the same doctor, to any kind of a competent professional who even knows what's going on with you, who knows what's in your case. There are other cases of people who, you know, these very specialized, like, gender clinics, and within their operating rooms are the ones who are doing these procedures, doing these surgeries. And then if somebody has some kind of a medical emergency, they'll go to a hospital, a general hospital, an emergency room, where really no ER doctor or specialist can be expected to know what to do in these very niche types of cases, because we're not talking about heart attacks and strokes, in your case at least. We're talking about a very niche, very specific, very life-threatening medical complication that nobody who was left to care for you was in any way capable of understanding or dealing with. There were basic flaws in the chain of communication, and everybody just shirking responsibility.
Oh, definitely. And it's still an issue I experience to this date. Like, I mean, the fact that I had such awful complications with my mastectomy, that doesn't go away. Like, we just had this storm move in, and I felt it in my knees and in my chest prior to it even appearing in the sky. And there was an issue for a long period of time where I would have this crushing chest pain, which you have crushing chest pain and you think the worst, right? But it would happen over and over again, and I'd end up in the ER, literally unable to speak at times because of how bad it was. And no one could tell me what was wrong with me. I saw so many different specialists, especially when I was still on the testosterone, and no one had any idea what was actually going on. And a lot of those issues resolved with the cessation of the testosterone, but for the ones related to my surgery, and specifically the complications of my surgery, I don't know that those are going to go away. I don't know that I'm ever going to stop experiencing chest pain when the weather changes. And that's something that's terrifying, especially as I get older and as the risk of something like a heart attack becomes more prominent. How am I going to know the difference between a weather front and a heart attack? How am I going to know when I'm actually having a serious problem that needs to be treated as emergent?
Wow. Yeah, it just really goes to show your story, not only the ways in which these doctors are, by engaging in gender medicine, failing to uphold the Hippocratic Oath and the oath to do no harm, not only just simply by the virtue of the type of medicine or the type of interventions, as would be more accurate to describe them, not only by doing this specific type of work are they failing to uphold their oath to their patients, but actually the nature of the bureaucratic sort of structuring within these institutions, these medical institutions, and the ways in which, gender medicine specialists, if you can call them that, are the ones doing these procedures, and then they're not able to follow up with you adequately. And the emergency room doctors, for example, they're not up to date on all of these extreme complications that are due to surgeries that very few but an increasing number of patients are having. And the complications could range from, they can range from basically some type of issues with your skin and just general post-surgical pain, all the way to some type of, freak complications that were the ones that you suffered. And nobody knows how to help patients like you. And this really goes to show that this entire field of medicine is not only an experimental field that is being done outside of experimental treatment protocols and clinical trials, right? And just the way that normal that normal sort of experimental trials would run, where you'd have control groups and where you'd have some people receiving the treatment, some people not receiving the treatment, and having it heavily documented all throughout the process, that what we're seeing now is that activists have infiltrated what is by nature scandalous medicine, and the role of activists and monetary interests have turned this from scandalous bad medicine into a whole-scale medical scandal. And so I think that what's really important to take away from this aspect of your story is that whether you get into transgender identification and pursue these types of hormonal and surgical interventions, whether it's as a prepubertal child, an adolescent who has already experienced some pubertal development, or as a vulnerable young adult, or a vulnerable older adult, that nobody is able to consent. None of these patient populations who are highly distressed have the capability to consent to especially the unknown medical complications of these surgeries. And
there's so many.
And there are so many that are unknown. The known ones are scary enough, but the unknown ones are even more terrifying.
Or the ones that are known but not talked about. Like recently I went to see my gynecologist, and this is a little bit more intimate, but I went to go see my gynecologist because I had these painful bumps on my clitoris, and I had no idea what was causing them, but they were causing me pain. And my doctor had to go look it up on a forum to figure out what it was. And it was actually something that was relatively well documented colloquially within doctors who treat transgender patients to be caused by testosterone, because of the fact that things aren't being lubricated properly down there. Testosterone causes excess sweat. It was a gland that had been blocked and developed into a cyst that she then had to numb the area and express. It was awful. Like, that procedure was awful. And no one talked about that, but apparently it's common enough for her to just be able to Google it, essentially. But no one was like, you're going to get cysts on your clit. Like, no one.
Wow. It's just incredible, the fact that these types of side effects are being discussed on internet forums,
Yep.
as opposed to in medical journals,
Yep.
as opposed to in,
Yep.
I don't know what, I don't know everything that, for example, goes on behind the scenes at WPATH. Michael Schellenberger's WPATH files do give us quite a bit of information, and that a lot of these gender doctors do understand that their patients are unable to consent. But the extent of these problems, like, there are far too many of them, I would imagine, for even the most well-intentioned doctors who are practicing gender medicine, who actually care about the health of their patients and monitoring these possible side effects. There are far too many of these complications for them to, even if they had a whole team dedicated to scouring these internet forums to find all of these different types of complications that could occur to someone and documenting them. Like, there's no possible way that even the most well-intentioned full team of doctors who recognize that there's an inherent flaw in the ways in which they're able to gather information about the types of medical complications that their patients could face, could even document them, study them, and adequately warn their patients about, especially at the rate in which people are being transitioned and put on a pipeline towards sort of permanent reliance upon pharmaceutical industries.
And I think it's telling that they're not even trying to do it. Like, I think they know this.
Right, at no step of the way do they seem to actually want to, even in some minuscule way, do no harm to their patients. And that's incredibly telling about the true motivations of these doctors and the ways in which they don't seem to even want to protect their patients on any level. So what's really important to take away from your part of the story, at least in my opinion, as a friend of yours and as somebody who's listening, is really the fact that, there's this discourse that mature adults can consent and that teenagers and children cannot. But what I have to say to this is that no patient of any age or of any level of mental or psychological stability is able to consent to outcomes that are not being documented, and that no doctor is even capable of doing research on outside of doing the type of research that people who are seeking these treatments may or may not even encounter online. Like, it shouldn't be the job of people who want to transition to try to figure out, maybe there are complications that our doctors aren't telling us about in our informed consent forms. Fundamentally, no patient can consent to outcomes that are not documented and that their doctors show absolutely no interest in even trying to come to an understanding of.
And there are things worse than death, and I think that's what people don't understand. Like, you think the worst thing that could happen to you with this is death? Like, there are things worse than death. So,
wow.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Soren, for coming on this channel of mine, and for shedding light on just the incredible complexities of your story, and some of the complications you've faced, because I presume that for many listeners, we will have some people who are still transitioning and are listening to this, and we also want them to be aware of the possible complications that their doctors may not be warning them about. And I would love to do a second part
definitely,
with you on my channel, in which we will discuss, really the process of psychologically desisting and then physically detransitioning, the social and medical complications of that, rebuilding a new life after transition, and really how our stories interplay. So I would love to do part 2 with you, and for all of our viewers, that will be up shortly after this episode is. Soren, thank you so much for coming on and for being one of the most sort of amazing and compassionate friends in my life, who's helped me deal with all kinds of different aspects of my desistance process. So
it's such a pleasure knowing you, truly.